Hello, everyone, and welcome back to class. So last class, we were talking about bias in psychology. It's so important to be aware of our own biases because they can creep into experiments and into interpretations in so many different ways. And it's not really enough to try to be aware of our own biases because our biases are going to get in the way of us perceiving them. There's confirmation bias. There's, we want to believe what we want to believe. We talk to the kind of people that agree with us, and so there's some principles in research that keep us on the narrow path. And one of them is a really important one is openness and transparency. If we're communicating something that that we want to believe or that makes us look good, we might not want to tell the whole story. We might want to exaggerate. We might want to overstate. But if we're really willing to sort of share that data and to talk about it and to listen to people who are outside of our echo chambers, then we can do better science. And there's an old concept, and it's a good one in vocational psychology, and it's that discernment, which is figuring out the truth and deciding what to do because of it, is best done in community because other people act as a check on our own self-deception, right? We can't smell our own BS, but other people can. And that's why I think it's so important to have an inclusive and diverse scientific community. So for that to work, we also have to research and speak and write with integrity and with openness and with transparency. So there's some other principles as well that protect us from bias. In psychology, the outcomes we're looking at are these big abstract philosophical constructs like intelligence. What's intelligence? Whoa. How do you measure that? You're never going to have a perfect measure of intelligence. Like even if you were able to define that concept in a way that everyone agreed with, the way you measure it is not going to capture all of that construct. Well-being. What is well-being? That basically means good being in a way that's good, and good is a matter of moral philosophy. People disagree about what that means. And, somebody might define well-being as how much joy you feel. Someone else might define it as the absence of suffering. Someone else might define it as, how much are you contributing to your community? So there might be a lot of different measures of well-being. So we're going to have to be really clear and really specific about how we're measuring something, so that when people look at our paper on well-being, well, the first thing they might want to do is go look at how we measured it and see, do they even agree with that measure? Is that a good measure? So our measures should be reliable and valid. And actually, that's a pretty tall order in psychology. How do you reliably measure well-being? How do you validly measure well-being? The reliability and validity of measures in psychology is nothing like the reliability and validity of measures in physics or chemistry. It's a lot, it's weaker. So think about here's a really reliable measure. Your food scale. Assuming you have a good quality food scale, every time you put something that weighs about 5 grams on it, it reads about 5 grams. Right? It's not saying 10 grams or 1 gram. If it did that, you'd be like, what's wrong with this scale? And maybe that's still a valid measure of weight. It's still weighing your apple, but the readings aren't reliable. They're going up and down. Now, let's say you stepped on your bathroom scale. That's a valid measure of your body weight. And it's probably pretty reliable, maybe not as reliable as your food scale. That's why you step on and off it every morning until you get a number that you like. But imagine if you said, I'm going to measure my well-being every morning. So what could be a reasonably valid measure of your well-being? Would stepping on your bathroom scale be a good measure of your well-being? It might be correlated, but no, right? That's not what it's measuring. The best we could do to measure your well-being is ask you some kind of really subjective question on a survey, like, rate your sense of well-being from between 1 and 5. And maybe one morning you give it like a 4, and one it's a 3. But can you see how like shifty that is? And it would depend on how you interpreted the question and your mood at the moment. So reliability and validity are different things. You can have a reliable measure that's not valid. Let's say that I'm using your bathroom scale as a well-being measure, and every time you step on the scale, it gives you about the same result. It's reliable, but it's not a valid measure of your well-being. It's a valid measure of something else, of your body weight. And then you could kind of have a crappy, cheap scale that is a valid measure of your body weight, but that is not too reliable, and the numbers fluctuate a bit. But they, on average, hit in the right place. Or you could have a scale that's reliable, but it's biased, right? Imagine if your scale constantly reads 2 pounds heavier, no matter what you do. It's always 2 pounds off. That's reliable. It's reliably off. Okay, but the bias is affecting the validity of its measure of your body weight. When there are randomized control trials, one thing that really helps pharmaceutical companies or anyone with an economic interest in selling a therapy of any kind, it really helps them to pre-register the study. And we see this for randomized control trials. And it's when you plan the study in advance and you say, this is what we're going to measure, this is how we're going to measure it, these are the people we're going to select, this is how we're going to put them into groups, this is the type of analysis that we plan to do on the data, and here are maybe some strengths or potential limitations. And then you run that by some reviewers, so other people can check that out to see if that's a good plan. And you'd also talk about the ways that you're going to control against bias. It's going to be a double-blind study, and the experimenter's not going to know who's in what group. And this is how we know they're not going to know. This is the plan. And sometimes that involves like the staff knowing, and there's all kinds of codes, and only the staff has the password, that kind of thing. And that helps guard against all the things you might do to change the way you conduct the study if you were, secretly hope your treatment would be proved efficacious. So let's say you're doing the study and it's not pre-registered. You might be tempted to make some changes to the protocol. I'll give you an example. There are something called outliers in a data set. So when you look at a graph of a correlation, most of the points might fall roughly along the line, and you'll say, okay, we like the look of that relationship. But what if there's some points that are like not behaving as we want them to? We call that an outlier. And there's a practice of excluding outliers. You're saying, okay, that participant was different in some way. We're just going to eliminate that data point. It doesn't look like it really belongs to this population. By data point that we don't like, that would weaken our results. And so if you analyze your data and you sort of didn't have a pre-registered study where you really have to stick to what you said you were going to do, you might run the analysis, find that it's null, and then think about ways that you could do a different analysis, right? Drop this, try that, use a different method, change the standard over here, could do that again, and then come up with significant results. And sometimes in order to do that, you want to change your hypothesis too. So now that maybe we're looking for a different kind of effect on a different variable because your questionnaire measured 30 different things and you didn't find any difference on the outcome of interest, but there's this other item that's kind of related, and let's look at that one, okay? So pre-registering helps with all of that kind of thing. There's an unfortunate trend in the system, right? Academics work within systems, and systems have their rewards and their punishments, and people do what they're rewarded for and don't do the things they're not rewarded for, generally speaking. We'll learn about that when we have a unit on learning, on it's like a operant condition. Reward someone for doing something and they'll do more of it. Punish them for doing it and they'll do less of it. And academics are rewarded for finding these statistically significant results. For, everyone wants to be the author on some breakthrough study. And scientific journals want to be publishing these breakthrough studies that everyone cites, and so that sends up the prestige of the journal. And so there's this pressure to find significant results, statistically significant results that comes from the system. But there's nothing wrong if you conduct a study that is well designed and it finds that there's no difference, right? There's a null result. There's no difference between the treatment and the control group. That's really important. Like, people, if I was thinking about taking a certain kind of drug or therapy, I'd be very interested in the study that found that there was no benefit, but maybe there were some adverse effects, or that, there's a cost, there's an opportunity cost to doing anything. So we should publish null results, but journals are less interested in publishing them. And if scientists do an experiment and they find a null result, there's a lot of work that goes into writing up a journal article and submitting it for publication, having it revised. And it's easier to just put that away and then, go do something else that could find that significant result. And so that's called the file draw problem. And so when you go and, let's say you're interested in you want to find out what the scientific research says about cognitive behavioral therapy, and you go find, there's 100 articles that say that it had a positive effect, that it had there was a statistically significant improvement in the treatment, the people who were treated with that. Well, what about the 500 studies that didn't find an effect, that didn't get published? So you see the problem? But so there's a job for you in maybe changing the system. Okay. But right now, what's reinforced is finding these sort of positive results, even if they're spurious. And there's research, some scientists have tried to replicate studies that have a statistically significant result that are published in the literature. Because remember, there's an effective chance. And let's say that the true difference between treatment control is 0. Well, it's not like every time you do a study, you find a difference of 0. There's a normal distribution around that. And sometimes you're going to find a really big effect, and sometimes you'll find a really big negative effect. And on average, across the infinite times you try the study, it averages out to 0. But there's a trend out there where the people who get the positive results are going to publish those. They'll get published, and the people who find the negative results will just put them away. Okay. And so some scientists have tried to do replication studies on what we assume are reliable effects in psychology, and we're not able to replicate them. So that's something to keep in mind. So we should publish sound science, even if it contradicts existing theories or just doesn't find any exciting result. And because of what I was telling you there about how if there's no difference, by chance, you're going to find some positive results, some negative results, they should average out. Well, we shouldn't base our decisions on one study. It's better to base our decisions on a summary of research. So there are things called systematic reviews that where a scientist goes and reads everything they can, everything that's been published on a certain question, like, does cognitive behavioral therapy treat depression? And then they summarize them. And the systematic review is a systematic way of looking for the research. It's like, you don't just pick the 5 most famous studies. You don't just pick the studies that are in your favorite journals. You sit down with a librarian, work down a really good search string that's going to cover everything. If you're doing a really good job, you'll look for unpublished studies. You'll look for studies that were published in the gray literature because the scientists didn't try to jump through the peer-reviewed published journals hoops. Okay, you get the idea. It's really comprehensive, really systematic. And then when you find a bunch of similar studies, there's a way to aggregate those results and to find kind of the average result. And that's called meta-analysis. But that said, the systematic reviewer is still working with what's been published. and they're still affected by publication bias. So if we're only publishing the positive results, that's what they're going to be finding. However, there are statistical techniques to assess publication bias, because if you find all, I don't know how to explain this. There are patterns when you gather the data and you plot that, saying, this study found this effect, this study found that effect. Bias, there's a way you can look at the graph and say, oh, it looks like we're only seeing one side of the story. You don't need to know that. I don't really have the words to explain it, but there are some ways that they can estimate publication bias, and it's definitely out there. So another really important principle is random selection, random assignment, and representative sampling. When we do a study, well, in psychology, we want to talk about, all humans. We want to generalize to all the people everywhere. And maybe we shouldn't be trying to do that. Maybe we should only be trying to generalize to, all Canadians. But 85% of research in psychology is done on undergraduates like you. Right? So in this course, you get to sign up for these research credits, and the participants are you and people who are very similar to you. And then we'll go and take those results and then speak of them as if they apply to everyone everywhere. So there's overgeneralization. If we wanted to generalize to global humanity, the way we obviously can't give your survey to every single person on the planet or every single adult on the planet. But what you could, well, you probably couldn't. Ideally, what you'd want to do is draw up a random sample of everybody, and that sample should look like the population. It's not guaranteed to, but if you do enough of that, if you do enough studies, the long run average is that your sample will reflect the population. And I use a pot of soup metaphor to explain this. And okay, so imagine there's a pot of soup of stew, and there's meat and potatoes and carrots and broth, and on the top of the soup, that's where the oil goes, right? The oil and the herbs float over there. And you're going to taste this soup, and you're blindfolded. You can't see it. You don't know what's in it. And you have a tiny little teaspoon, or you have a small spoon. And what would happen if you just dipped your spoon into the top of the soup? And then you just have a spoonful of oil. And you taste that and you're like, oh, this soup is just oil. The whole pot is nothing but oil. Well, no, you didn't. You had a very biased sample of the soup. So what you should do is stir the pot of soup so that all the peas and carrots sort of come up from the bottom. And, a bigger spoon is better than a smaller spoon. So maybe we're going to use a ladle instead of a teaspoon. And bring that up, and now try that soup, and you're like, okay, this is a meat stew with vegetables, right? You have your inference about the population is better from a larger random sample. But in psychology, how do we get that random sample of the population? There are better ways and worse ways. Asking undergraduates in your class to participate in studies is, not one of the best ways to get a random sample or a representative sample of the population. It's a non-random sample. But Statistics Canada has its methods because they do a census. And so Statistics Canada would have way more power to recruit a random sample. And in fact, there were laws that made, you had to participate in their study. You couldn't say no. There was some kind of a political battle over that about 10 years ago. So I think we've actually already talked about this slide before about reliability and validity. Reliability is kind of the consistency of the measurement. So if that measuring tape is reliable and you're 5'4", I should be able to measure you 10 times over and, you know, you're 5'4" every time. But that assumes that your height is unchanging, which is the case. But what if I were to use a 1 to 5 scale about your mood, and I measure your mood 5 times in a day, and I get different results? Does that mean that my measure is unreliable? Or does that mean that your mood actually changed? Can't tell, can you? Right? It's much harder to assess the reliability of a measure when what you're measuring is something that can fluctuate. And a lot of the things we measure in psychology, right? What are you thinking? How are you feeling? Are things that actually fluctuate. I wouldn't expect your intelligence to fluctuate from one day to the other. But your mood? Absolutely. So test, retest reliability is a kind of reliability. It's a way of checking to see whether scores are fluctuating from one test to the other. But it's not, if what you were measuring was something that we know is unchanging, like your height, or I would say your intelligence, then if the measure is fluctuating, it suggests there's something wrong with the measure. But if you're measuring something that actually fluctuates, well, now that's a more difficult task. Then there's something called inter-rater reliability. So let's say that I am measuring your mood, right? How happy do you seem on a 1 to 5 scale? Well, will my research assistant say the same thing? What if I think that, yeah, you look like a 4 out of 5? Between raters, but if my research said you look like a 1 out of 5 on happiness, well, what's going on there? Maybe we need to, maybe I need to do some training. Maybe we need to talk about the operational definition of happiness that we're using, and are we using a good one? And are we all using the same one? Typically, you know, inter-rater reliability of 75% is considered good. You're never going to get 100%. So there's different kinds of studies that we can do if we want to look into a question. Naturalistic observation is when you go out in the world and watch what's happening and describe it. So let's say that I want to, you know, I'm interested in school bullying. So I go and sit on a park bench and watch kids in the playground at recess. And I just watch what they're doing, and I count the number of times that, you know, the kids seem to make each other cry or punch each other or something like that. Naturalistic observation absolutely has its strong points. All the study designs do, and sometimes it's the only way you can study something. It's the only way you can study something that would be unethical to study otherwise. Like, you can't do a randomized control trial where you make some of the kids bully each other. But naturalistic observation also has its weaknesses. Imagine if you were the person that was with the clipboard in the playground watching what's going on. Well, you can't look at more than one kid at once, can you? So you're going to miss a lot. And for that reason, maybe there need to be 10 of you, and you're all keeping track. And then afterwards you meet and find out, you know, compare notes and consider your inter-rater reliability. And maybe, you know, you missed some things that someone else picked up. That is really costly. It's costly in terms of time and personnel and money that you need to pay the personnel for their time. And there are case studies. And a case study is it's a really in-depth study of like one person. In a naturalistic observation, you're not intervening. Okay, you're not going in and saying, hey, you're not breaking up the kids. You're not talking to them. You're not saying, hey, what happened there? But in a case study, you might have a child with you. Maybe it's a child that identifies as having been the target of bullying, and you talk to them about that. And you really get to know that child and what happened to them. And maybe that tells you something about what school bullying is like. There's a good comment there from Mika saying, also the presence of the person with the clipboard in the school year might influence the behavior in the school year. Absolutely. Assuming you even got ethics for that study, I'll put that question aside for now, but there's a really good point there. Yeah, if people knew that they're being observed, they might act differently. Imagine if the teacher said to the kids, okay, a scientist from the university is coming here to study whether you're bullying each other or not. They're the ones with the clipboard sitting on the bench. Maybe the kids would all start acting nice to each other. Imagine if I was doing a naturalistic observation of nose picking. I want to get a sense of what the baseline frequency is of nose picking. So I watch you all. And if you know that, you might act differently. So yes, very good point there. With the case study, you kind of go in depth on studying a particular individual. And so let's say you interview this child that's been bullied, what happened to you and who's perpetrating it and who are they friends with? And you might be able to get a picture of what the phenomenon of bullying looks like based on this interview with one child, but it'd be an incomplete picture. And that's why multiple case studies are better than one case study, but case study methods are biased too, because what kid's going to be comfortable enough to talk to you about it? Is that child different in some way? Maybe they're more extroverted. What if they're making it up to get attention and everything they said is untrue and you just drew some universal principles about bullying from that? So limitations to case studies, but what case studies are useful for is that they allow us to study things that we could never study experimentally. So consider brain damage. So a psychologist can learn about how the brain works by studying damage. So let's say, but you can't go into people's brains and say, okay, we're going to destroy this part of your brain and we want to see how that changes your behavior in order to understand what that part of the brain does. Can't do that as an experiment. But there are people who get into accidents who have a certain part of the brain that's damaged. And then you might learn about them. How do they get on their daily life? What function have they lost? That kind of thing. And then that could tell you something about that part of the brain, especially when there's multiple case studies on people who all have that type of brain damage. Self-report measures and surveys are a way lower cost way of doing research, and that's why you see more of it. So that's probably what you'll be doing when you sign up for studies at Mount A. You'll get a survey, and there'll be items, and you answer often on what's called a Likert scale that goes from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And then the researchers will have some hypothesis that they're not going to tell you about, because then that would affect your responding. But they might be looking, say, for some kind of correlation. Does, hours spent studying affect GPA and your sense of satisfaction in the institution? So it's really easy, especially when you're doing it online, to get a large sample, because you can, it's like half an hour to fill in this survey and we'll give you a credit point or maybe put you in a raffle. And there are even websites like MTurk where people just fill in surveys in order to help make a living. So you can recruit much larger samples. It's way less costly, but self-report isn't perfect either. I'm sure that there are many times when you're filling in a survey and you don't really understand the question. You're like, hey, wait a minute, I'm not sure what you mean. It depends. I don't know. And there's no way for you to indicate that response. You just have to pick 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I get those questions all the time. And I'm like, I don't know, 3. Okay, so sometimes what the respondent is writing doesn't really reflect what you think you're measuring. And people can lie on surveys too. Let's say that I gave you a survey about your nose picking frequency. Well, Are you going to underestimate it there? You might. So there's still socially desirable responding. Sometimes people malinger. So let's say that you could, I don't know, get out of writing the exam if the well-being survey I gave you had a low enough score. Well, you might really emphasize your stress then, right? If it was in your interest to respond in a certain way, like either to please me or to get something out of it. Correlational studies are when we measure two variables at the same time without manipulating them. So let's say I'm interested in sleep and grade. If I was doing a correlational study on sleep and grade, I would, I'd pull your grades and I would give you a survey asking you to how much you sleep every night, or maybe I might ask you to track your sleep every day for a week, something like that. Okay, measure your sleep as you're sleeping, not intervening. Measure your grades. I'm not doing anything to intervene in your grades. And then when I get all your scores, I could look for an association between them. And I might find that students who have more hours of sleep get higher grades, and that'd be a correlation. But if I wanted to prove that more sleep increases grade, I'd have to do an experimental study when maybe you come into my sleep lab and you might be in the group where you get to sleep all you want. Or I might randomly assign you to the group where you get woken up after 8 hours, or the group where you get woken up after 7 hours or 3 hours, or the group where you're not allowed to sleep at all. That would prove causation because I'm manipulating the independent variable, which is sleep, and then measuring the dependent variable, which is your grade. So in an experimental design, the experimenter manipulates the independent variable and then tries to control for anything else that could affect the result. So I want to do this in my sleep lab and not have you sleep at your place where there could be differences in mattresses, and some people have cats and dogs, and that could mess up my results somehow. So the textbook says something that I'll come back to later because I don't quite agree. They say that naturalistic observation has high external validity and that the findings are generalizable to the real world. I don't agree with that idea of like one real world. If you do a naturalistic observation and you do it well, then the findings are generalizable to that context and to other very similar contexts. Okay, not everywhere else. But you can't draw any cause or effect inferences because you have not manipulated one of the variables. All you can see is that they're co-occurring. All you can see is like the development of a phenomenon. In your book, they said something that was interesting, and I'd never considered it before, but I think they might be right. They said that the scientific method is a myth. They're saying that we're using this term, the scientific method, mythically, and in a way that implies that there is one scientific method, the scientific method, when in fact scientists use very many different methodologies, and there's some methodologies that we privilege over others because they seem more scientific, like say quantitative methods tend to be privileged over qualitative methods. Quantitative methods are like when you give that survey and you get people to choose, the response out of 5. So you get some numbers to work with. But there's pros and cons to different methodologies, and a qualitative method would be asking them, how do you feel? And then they'll give you much less convenient data because they'll write different amounts and they'll write about different things. But there are qualitative methods by which you can summarize what people said and draw up the core themes. Those are different methodologies. But then they talk about the real world in the same way as if there was one real world. So what is the real world? And I'm thinking, well, are they using this in what are they talking about? They seem to be talking about outside the laboratory. They're sort of inside the psych lab, and then outside the psych lab. But outside the lab isn't just one place. And it's not like you do some lab study and then it gets generalized to this mythical real world. It may only generalize to certain contexts that are similar to the ones in your lab study. And so this real world idea is stripped of social context, right? There is no one real world for everyone. Like there's always a local social context with a culture from which you're drawing your results. We're trying to generalize your results into, right? We speak as if there's one social macrocosm, and there isn't, right? There's always, you're always in some microcosm. But when we do that, when we play that game, what we're usually doing is assuming a particular microcosm, which is some very privileged social context, and then kind of assuming that that represents universal humanity. In a course I taught last semester, I asked students what I could do for them. What did they hope I'd do in the class? And they asked me to teach them about the real world. That I teach them things that are applicable to the real world. And I was like, wait a minute, what is that? What is the real world, and who's on top of it in such a way that they can describe it accurately and study it objectively, as if I, the instructor, knows about the real world, and this is what it's like, and this is what you need to know before you go out into the real world, right? As if I don't come with a context and a positionality. So there's no place or position where you ever live in or see the whole one real world. That's a mythical abstraction, right? There's no place where you're on top of the world and can see and understand it with pure objectivity. Okay, that's a mythical place and a mythical idea, but it's one that's really ingrained in us, right? To the point that it's even in the textbook that is selling you on critical thinking and on calling out myths. You can see how easy it is to do that. So there's this idea that psychology teaches us about principles of human behavior that apply to the real world. And I always like to think, right, whose real world? And what is this sort of mythical macrocosm that our research is supposed to apply to? But really, what microcosm is it? So I want to get into this idea of the real world. So, who could be on top of the real world and able to know and describe it? So I went with, think about the president of the United States, because he's called the leader of the free world, right? Is he on top of the world? Right? No, because he still lives in a microcosm, right? There's a few people he sees. He sees his family, his close colleagues in the Democratic Party, directors of government bureaus, his security detail, military generals, some reporters. And there's only a few places he can go. He's at the White House, Air Force One, at rallies, but he can't just go down to Pizza Corner and get a donaire and chat with people there and see what their world is like. And he can't just go to somewhere on the other side of the world without a whole lot of setup. And all that setup kind of insulates him from, and it stops certain information from getting to him. So he only knows a few people, and he's only going to get some information, and it's a small part of everything about the world. Okay, so he lives in a little world. It's a very high profile and a very powerful little world, but it's still a microcosm, right? There's still so much that he does not see and cannot know. And so all of us, and no matter who you are and what you do or how profile it is, you're always going to be in some microcosm, some local social context that's bounded by region and by history and by demographics and by culture. Okay, there isn't one social real world. There are billions of microcosms that overlap and intersect. And so I think about this when I look at cityscapes and I see all the windows in the big buildings. I think that behind every one of those windows is a little microcosm. It's someone's little world. And all those microcosms come with a culture, right? With norms and scripts and roles. There's some projects, there's some interpersonal drama, there's the boss and the secretary, there's the time that some lackey got chewed up in a meeting. And then just upstairs, right, or across the road, there's some other microcosm that has its own cast of characters. There's plots and intrigues, and it knows or cares nothing about the other tiny microcosms around it. But those microcosms behind those windows are all pretty similar because they're all taking place in the same larger national culture. But on the other side of the world, things would look pretty different, okay? So the lab setting is a real world of its own, right? This classroom setting is a real world. It's my real world. It's yours for another 10 weeks, and then it'll evaporate, and you'll find some new microcosm. In psychology, we tend to look at really privileged microcosms and then call that the real world. And if you take IO psychology and study the history of it, something you might hear about a lot is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York in 1911. It was a manufacturing tragedy when women who were sewing shirts were locked inside the factory floor to sort of, make them more productive. And something caught fire and they couldn't get out. And so tragically, they sort of jumped to their death. And when that happens in an IO psychology class, the story is, oh, okay, we learned from this terrible tragedy. And, now we have all these occupational health and safety rules, and that doesn't happen anymore. And there's a sense of congratulating ourselves for all the development. Right? But what you don't hear about is, I don't know if you've ever seen the picture of that building collapse, right? That's Rana Plaza. It's in Bangladesh. And that happened in 2013. And I never heard about that in any IO psychology history course that I talk, right? That's where you can see labels like Joe Fresh, Walmart, Zara, Benetton, that we wear in the rubble, right? And the people that sewed our clothes in the rubble because the factory collapsed on them. What we don't talk about is how we outsourced the manufacturing to people in other microcosms on the other side of the world that don't have those basic safety protections, right? In IO psychology, our view is like our whole real world is everything's changed and is better. But no, the real story is you outsourced manufacturing, okay? So my point here is that some real worlds are much more real to us in psychology than others, okay? Some microcosms are more privileged, and what happens in them and what applies to them seems to matter and have some kind of a universal quality. Whereas when these other microcosms they're kind of marginalized, we don't think about them, we don't talk about them or what happens in them, and people there may have sort of very different experiences. So when we talk like there's one real world, what we're sort of actually doing is taking a particular position, a particular vantage point, and it's probably the vantage point of a powerful or privileged groups, right? The class privileged professional, Western, typically white psychologists who are coming up with the theories and doing the research that's then tested on class privileged university undergraduates. So, and then we talk and we teach and we think about life as if that perspective, if that what is really a privileged subjectivity is actually some general universal truth. And when we do that, we marginalize and neglect the very other real world and experiences of those who have lower social status, right? That is a lot of people and a lot of worlds, right? And they're real. They have there are many, many indigenous psychologies because there are many, many local social contexts. But indigenous psychology, say Latin American psychology, South African psychology, it recognizes and honors that subjectivity and that importance of local context and of being relevant to it. But the mainstream practice in psychology is to speak from that very privileged, particularly class privileged positionality that's also tends to be sort of Western European and heteronormative, and to sort of assume that that perspective has sweeping universality. And that's tempting because it casts psychology as like a hard science that has these reliable universal laws, kind of like the law of gravity that works everywhere, and could offer a reliable calculus for predicting people's behavior. And wouldn't you like to be the psychologist that published that paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology and it got 5,000 citations? But really, that's wishful thinking and false advertising. And I think that psychology is actually way more useful and way more powerful and effective and serviceable when we can own and understand that subjectivity and the importance of context, right? When we're not ashamed to be social scientists. So psychology as a discipline can be a bit of a case study, a series of case studies of the hyperprivileged microcosms. And studying one group of person in depth is one way to do research, but we need to understand the limitations of that research. And that one of the best things that it can do is help us come up with hypotheses that we can then go test in a better study. Maybe I shouldn't say better study, more generalizable study. I think that we've actually, I'm flipping through these slides and I think I've covered them because I mentioned it as a tangent to something else I was saying. Something I do see here, a term that I didn't find was a response set. So we talked about how when you fill in a survey, you might be motivated to act in a certain way. So let's say that the survey was given to you by your potential employer at a job interview, and it's about your personality. Wow, well, most people would be really motivated to respond in a certain way to suggest they have excellent work ethic and never lie and always get along with other people, because those would be the socially desirable responses. Acting in that way is called a response set. Self-report studies are when you fill in the survey about yourself, but your way of seeing yourself could be biased, right? Let's say you're a bit narcissistic. You might say, yes, my skills at everything are amazing and everyone loves me. You get the idea. So we can get better assessments of people if you get other people who are close to them, or who can observe them, to also give ratings. And on a personality test, your friends will rate you differently than you rate yourself because they see a different side of you, right? Maybe there's a certain way you act around your friend. You always try to be really upbeat because you want to have fun. And so is the observer report wrong? It's different. And we could maybe get the best assessment of your personality by looking at your report of yourself and maybe reports from some people who know you, and then maybe some reports from people who are trying to be objective and have watched your behavior in a laboratory. If they all say, wow, you're an extrovert, and you think you're an extrovert, well, then that, maybe you're probably an extrovert. But and you also see this when we're rating people in the workplace for performance, which they say in IO psychology. Some of the better performance evaluations called 360 feedback. So it's not just what your manager thinks of you, right? Very often your performance report is just based on what your manager thinks. But what if your manager has it out for you, right? What if your manager never really sees you and is mixing you up with someone else? Well, it might be better to get your manager's report of your performance and also ask the same questions to the people on your team and to the people that you're serving. And then that's called 360-degree feedback. And, really, there's no one perfect way of doing research in psychology. There's always going to be some strengths and there's always going to be some limitations. But if you do enough research, if you look at the question from enough different angles and bring that all to the table, then you can kind of get a pretty good idea of what's going on, right? Observer reports also have drawbacks, right? Your friend only sees you when you're in a certain mood. Your boss has it out for you because he really wants to give that job to his nephew. You get the idea. But kind of the more research you do from different perspectives, the more the easier it is to get a good big picture of a phenomenon. It is now 10:20 a.m. and I will stop the recording and hang around if there are any questions.